Welcome to McNeil Tech, the wash experience. My name is Scott Ferry and I work for Budco, a distributor of McNeil wash systems. Our video today is going to demonstrate how to replace the shaft and the bearing in the vertical arm assembly of the SuperFlex brush. This is considered a difficult repair and it does require some specialized tooling to do the work. When working on any equipment, understand all the hazards associated with the task. Before starting any work, lock out and tag out the equipment. Take all necessary safety precautions, including personal protective gear, which includes but is not limited to safety glasses, gloves, and footwear. The electrical does need to be locked out, as with any repair that you do on any piece of equipment. But in this case, it is particularly important to make sure that's done so that if this ends up being a long-term repair, that everything is secured. Make sure that you tie the wires back, cover them, coat them, secure them to make sure that they don't pose a hazard. Also, when disconnecting this, it's a good idea to label the wires or take a picture of the wires so that when you place them back and reconnect, you can do it so that the rotation is correct on the brush. And also important to note, this should only be done by a qualified individual. In order to perform this task, we do need to shut the air off to the SuperFlex. That's so that we don't have any pressure holding this stabilizer cylinder in place. So what we're going to do here is we have to free this cylinder off of the vertical arm so that we can use the material lift to actually remove the arm assembly. So we'll go ahead and remove this bolt here. Now with this removed, we can actually remove the cylinder by removing this pin here. And we're going to go ahead and set that up on top of the oil pot and out of our way. Before we do this step, it's really important to mention that we're going to be removing the vertical brush assembly from the framework. So we're going to lay it on the ground, which means that prior to doing this step, we need to wash the floor down so that we don't contaminate the brush. But we start by removing this lock collar right here, and it's already a little bit loose. And then just take special care to not lose the hardware. This is a 1/4 28 fine thread socket cap screw, but that's not an easy one to find. Now with that removed, we can just push the shaft out from the pivot head weldment and lay the brush on the floor. One thing we want to talk about right now is the proper rigging to remove this with the material lift. So the material lift is the special tool mentioned earlier, and it really assists in doing this safely without potential injuries from lifting a heavy awkward object. So on both the front and back side of the vertical assembly, there's a threaded portion where the stabilizer cylinder attaches. And so we've gone ahead and put a bolt through that on both sides, both the front side and the back side. And the reason we're doing this is it is really important to not lift by the motor. You need to use the framework of the equipment in order to lift the brush assembly. And putting bolts in here is the safest and most efficient way of doing it. So we can attach our strap on the front and the back, and then we can lift this. Now once you've got a little bit of tension on the strap and you're lifting some weight off of the arm, then you can remove the locking collar up on the pivot head weldment over here on the other side. And with that locking collar removed, then you can just simply pull the assembly off of the pivot head weldment and then lay it down to do your work. We have the brush on a table for ease of demonstration. The first thing we're going to do is remove this plate right here, and that plate is going to give us access to the flange, the inside that's holding the brush core, to the shaft. And that's going to give us access to get in there. So we need to remove the 3 bolts from the flange inside the hub. And we do that with 2 20-inch extensions. And get back in there. And then we can go ahead and remove it. So up until this point, we've been working with live equipment. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we've actually pulled a subassembly from the factory to demonstrate how to remove the shaft and the bearings from the subassembly. But this is the point where you may encounter difficulties or complications in the repair. So earlier in the video, we talked about making sure things were locked out and tagged out, and this is where it becomes important. It is possible that if this motor had been replaced by a technician at some point in its lifespan, they may not have applied anti-seize to the shaft of the motor, or of the shaft where it comes through the motor. And if that's the case, this motor may be seized on the shaft. So you want to make sure you've taken precautions to ensure a safe work environment. But the first thing that we're going to do is remove the cap. So a 6mm wrench is what you need to do that. Next, we're going to remove the keeper bushing that holds the shaft in the motor in the right position. So we take a 5/16 inch Allen wrench and insert it into the screw. Now, as we do this, the shaft will rotate on us. And so we'll need to brace the shaft or secure the shaft so that we have enough leverage to break that loose. Now, in this case, I've inserted a screw in the flange on the other side, and I've got a pry bar in place to hold it, to brace it. Then I can go ahead and break that loose, and I can remove this. Now, there is one thing that's really important to mention here, and that is having to do with the hardware. So there's a lock washer here, and this is what's called a high collar lock washer. And that is a specialized washer that you're not going to find at most hardware stores. So make sure to take care to not lose that, and it's also a good idea to have some spares on your truck. And we can go ahead and remove this. And this is what the keeper bushing looks like. Now that we've got that removed, we can remove the hardware that holds the motor on the framework of the vertical arm assembly. Okay, with all of the hardware removed, now we can just pull the motor off of the shaft. Okay, now we've got the hardware removed, we can actually remove the motor from the shaft. So I've got a little gap in there, and I can just kind of pry that apart and remove the motor. Then we can set that aside, and now we'll move on to the bottom side of it and remove the taper lock and the bearing. Next step is to remove the taper lock flange on the bottom of the shaft. So we first need to remove our cotter pin, and next the castle nut. So I've got a screw in here to be used to use with a pry bar to brace it, and that remove that fairly easy there. Okay, now I'll use a puller here to remove the taper lock flange. Now that's off of there. Now we can go back and remove the bearing. To remove the bearing, we first have to loosen the set screws. Now with those set screws removed, we have room to move the bearing. So we'll go ahead and remove the bearing. Now to remove the bearing, we just need to remove this key here. And then we can slide the bearing off of there. Okay, so we've cleaned up. This is a new shaft to put in place. So this is kind of tricky. Just kind of shove this heavy shaft through. Now the important thing to do here is we're going to install the bearing first, but we need to apply some anti-seize to the portion where the bearing is in contact. Now we can replace the bearing. We've also reapplied anti-seize to the bolts in preparation for reassembly. Now we can retighten everything. Also really important to do here is to tighten the set screws again on the bearing. Now we can put the taper lock back on. We also need to reapply some anti-seize to this threaded portion of the shaft. So now we can replace the castle nut. Now this is a really important part of the reassembly process. The castle nut has to be tight, but not so tight that you can't it needs to be tight, but tightened to the point that you can reinsert the cotter pin. And as always, it's a good idea to have a spare cotter pin available in case the one that pulls out, in case you have to destroy the one that you remove. Now we're going to tighten that up. So I can see the hole through there to put the castle nut. So I'll go ahead and put that back in there. Now we can bend the cotter pin and switch around to the other side to put the motor on. To replace the motor, we need to coat the shaft with anti-seize, a nice thin coat, and that will make it easy to replace the motor the next time there's a need. With the anti-seize in place, we can put the motor back on. With the motor in place again, we coat the hardware with anti-seize before reassembly. Now we've got all four bolts tight and in place. We're going to replace the keeper bushing. And of course, we can't forget to put a little bit of anti-seize on there. We go ahead and reinsert that. Anti-seize on the screw. We'll put the screw in. And this will be another instance where it's going to be important to secure the shaft so that it doesn't rotate on us when we try to tighten this down. Now with the keeper bushing back in place and tight, we can put the cap back on. And again, anti-seize on those bolts or screws.
If I get to a point and it's 12 minutes long and it's like...
The cap's now in place and this is reassembled and ready for reinstallation. So at this point, we would reinstall the core or the brush core over the vertical arm assembly and reattach the core with the 3 bolts in the 3-bolt flange on the bottom of the shaft. Then we can secure it and lift it into position and begin the completion of our repair. With the core re-secured to the flange, we can replace our plate that holds the foam in place. Now, to do this, there's a couple things to keep in mind. We have to have this lined up. Well, the foam it'll release off of the core a little bit, and so if you were to tighten this 1/2-inch bolt all the way down, you wouldn't be able to line the plate up to be able to put the screws in these 2 outer holes. So you get your screw almost in place, and then you can take a screwdriver or a piece of threaded rod to line this up. So you get this in here and line it up to where you'll be able to put those screws in. Then you can take your wrench and tighten it down all the way. Now you can come back and put your 1/4-20 bolts in and secure it in place. To reassemble this, we need to put the top shaft through the pivot head weldment. Well, oh, there we go. Once you've got it through, then you can reinstall the locking collar, and that locking collar will keep it in position. With the locking collar reinstalled, we can go ahead and reassemble the air cylinder, put that back in position, and also reconnect our electrical. So the stabilizer cylinder is now reattached, and we've reattached our electrical. Now, when reattaching the electrical, it's really important to not over tighten the posts or the studs inside the motor. They are easy to shear and break off, so you really don't have to get after it on the wrench to get them tight enough. So now with that in place, we can replace our cover. And then, once we've got our cover replaced, it's really important to test rotation. Now, the SuperFlex is absolutely vital to have it turning the correct rotation, and if you need reference, there is a decal on the conveyor facing side of the secondary arm that tells us the correct rotation and speed. So we're going to finish this and then test rotation, and we will be finished with our repair. Once the work is complete and the conditions deemed safe, the lockout tagout can be removed. Once any repair is complete, always make sure to test for proper rotation and function of the equipment. Thank you for joining us at McNeil Tech, the Wash Experience.